Stop talking. Joaquim, your suggestion is just slum maths. Real mathematicians don't think that way. What happens when a 12-year-old black student's creative solution is mocked by a haughty teacher, but ultimately attracts the interest of one of the world's most famous scientists? Joaquim Oliveira was set to demonstrate that brilliance does not automatically entail privileges at a prominent university where wealth frequently triumphs over intelligence. Nobody had any idea what would happen when his novel method of resolving a challenging geometry problem was mocked by the public. It was all captured on camera. The derision, the disdain, the isolation. On the other hand, the internet has an odd way of making things right in unanticipated ways. Joaquim Oliveira has a special affinity with numbers. It seemed as though everything around him vanished when his fingers made contact with the blackboard. He saw more than simply answers. He also noticed connections and patterns that went beyond standard arithmetic. His opinions occasionally contradicted what he had learned. But he wasn't scared of it. Joaquim saw mathematics as a kind of art, a language for uncovering something bigger and invisible to others. But the time had come to try this novel approach of doing things. Tell us where you are watching from before we head back. Make sure to subscribe if this tale resonates with you, because I have something very unique planned for you tomorrow. At the rear of the classroom, Professor Eduardo Machado, wearing a fitted suit and his ever-vigilant eyes, watched Joaquim. The black child refused to comply with his request that everyone solve the geometry issue using the conventional method. Joaquim wasn't merely looking for a solution. He wanted to challenge every theory and formula in order to comprehend why things were the way they were. Eduardo's eyes were like a razor, ready to sever Joaquim's attempt at anything unusual. The young man's style of expression, in some ways, went against the grain. There was an awkward hush in the group as Joaquim described his strategy. Not only was he tackling the issue, but he was also inventing something bold and novel. To Professor Eduardo, however, what he considered innovation was just quirkiness. Joaquim kept thinking, real mathematicians don't think like that. He felt like an outsider there. Even though he understood that maths was more than just following the rules, the humiliation followed. Eduardo removed Joaquim's solution from the blackboard with a disdainful motion. It sounded like a death sentence as the rubber scraped across his work. It was made worse by his classmates' muted laughter. Joaquim, however, was not helpless. A knot started to form in his throat. But he resisted the need to cry. Not in front of them. Not there. He was aware that the moment would somehow strengthen his resolve. Joaquim found it difficult to look Professor Eduardo Machado in the eye following the humiliation in public. He could still picture the professor's sardonic grin, as though he had been more than a mere roadblock. Joaquim's behavior appeared to be an insult to Eduardo's authority. In an attempt to make sense of what had transpired, the young guy mentally repeated, "This isn't maths. This is a mistake." The teacher seemed to perceive only the shortcomings. Even though he had tried his hardest, every step he took to build his own confidence was undermined by the fear of not being seen and accepted. As Eduardo's remarks replayed in his head, Joaquim understood that maths was not the only issue. It was about his identity and his values. He was a young black guy trying to find his place in a culture that still viewed him as inferior at the time. Not merely a student attempting to grasp maths. The instructor appeared to be testing not only his skills, but also his ability to survive in that setting. Can someone like me really fit in here? Joaquim asked himself as a result of this clash of worldviews. His pupils' hushed laughter served as a harsh reminder of his isolation, beyond the teacher's animosity. He understood. There was the burden of social expectations, as a young black guy attempting to compete in a setting that seemed to have no place for him. He became the target of jokes in his class. What wounded his soul more than any criticism was this seclusion. The environment around him seemed to contradict his desire to fit in. Joaquim, however, did not lose. He was aware that he couldn't and would not let that moment to define who he was. Rather than contracting, he experienced an increase in internal resistance. He would rise once more. not just to demonstrate his mathematical prowess, but also to question all that had been forced upon him. He would not yield to bigotry or the narrow-mindedness of his teacher, even if he didn't win then. His adventure was only getting started. At Preston Academy, Joaquim felt completely out of his element. Despite his talent, he was even brilliant. His presence was noted, but not in a good manner, in an environment that looked to be dominated by the offspring of politicians, business people, and other powerful individuals. He stood out. Joaquim had to bear the weight of being the sole representation of a far-off reality. Whilst many of his classmates never had to worry about anything, he was aware that he needed to be extraordinary to be noticed. However, that did not ensure that his actual abilities would be acknowledged. Joaquim's greatest problem was that, in spite of everything he did, he knew that his original ideas and astute thinking would not be accepted. The school system he encountered was designed to incentivize conformity rather than creativity. He enjoyed mathematics, but he would have to conform to predetermined norms in order to be accepted. He understood that staying true to his vision could cost him more than a grade or an award. Thus, this led to an internal conflict. But hardship just strengthened Joaquim's resolve. He realized he was getting closer to demonstrating something more than his academic prowess. With each problem he solved and each solution he devised, he aimed to demonstrate that a black youngster from a slum in the suburbs could excel in mathematics and attain the greatest levels of schooling. He refused to let himself be forgotten, disregarded, or diminished to everyone who regarded him with distrust. He would respond with excellence. Joaquim had to deal with the difficulty of being acknowledged for his talent rather than his background as he attempted to understand his position in that hostile atmosphere. He began to doubt who he was as a result of the pressure to conform to a system that continued to disregard his past. However, he was unaware that the stereotypes and prejudices that concealed behind the doors he was attempting to open with his sharp mind would be the true enemy he would face. He was unaware at the time that his quest for the truth would include far more than he had anticipated. There was more activity in the cafeteria than before. As usual, Joaquim and Aisha were sitting in a quiet nook. But there was a change in the air. Despite the tremendous pressure, he had made an effort to maintain his academic focus. He overheard two kids in front of him, Carlos Ribeiro and Andre Ferreira, laughing at his actions the previous day during lunch. They made fun of his behavior, acting as though he was the only one who didn't understand the rules and education were a game. Joaquim could feel the anger burning in his eyes, but he kept his mouth shut and did everything he could to avoid reacting. He was aware that any deceptive action would just serve to validate their perception of him. Joaquim's desk was approached by Carlos, who smiled mockingly and remarked, "I guess you're still trying to be Einstein. Huh, you were not present at the Math Olympics. Will you succeed with ghetto maths?" Joaquim felt Carlos' words pierce his chest like sharp knives. However, something inside him changed, and he refused to give in to the provocation. He believed that he now possessed something more potent than any insult, his own intellect and the capacity to demonstrate, by his mathematical prowess, that what they viewed as an error was, in fact, genius beyond their comprehension. Aisha got up and interrupted the conversation as Carlos and Andre kept making fun of him. "You don't know anything about him," she continued, maintaining a steady stare. "You're not aware of his abilities. Additionally, you lack the bravery to learn." Aisha didn't have to add anything more. Her remarks had an evident effect. Joaquim felt stronger, and she was prepared to stand up for him. Her statements were powerful not only because they made sense, but also because she was steadfast in her belief in the truth. Joaquim realized that he was fighting against prejudice and illiteracy in addition to mathematics. Although Aisha's defense made him feel stronger, his concerns started to resurface. In such a restricted, inflexible environment, he questioned whether his vision actually mattered. As challenges piled up in front of him, it seemed harder and harder to pursue his own path. Being excluded was too much to handle on one's own. But he was driven by an inner voice to persevere and demonstrate that maths could be more than just formulas. It could be a means of expressing oneself, of questioning the status quo, and most importantly, of being noticed. Joaquim noticed that maths was more than just formulas and numbers. He saw artwork. Every geometric idea and equation was like a painting on a blank canvas. Maths was poetry to him. It was not only about solving problems, but also about examining the gaps between concepts and the unseen patterns that underlie everything. He had spent whole nights over the last few weeks working through difficulties. Not because he had to, but because he felt compelled to utilize these patterns to make sense of the universe. Where others saw only difficulty, he saw beauty. Joaquim was aware, though, that his perception of maths differed from that of his professors and peers. To them, mathematics was about rigorous guidelines, tried-and-true techniques, and precise outcomes. Joaquim believed that mathematics was a living language that should be freely and creatively explored. He realized that some would view his desire for recognition for his ideas as a challenge to the status quo. But he couldn't help it. Conventional bounds didn't apply to his way of thinking. During one of these periods of introspection, Joaquim nearly became sidetracked by his own calculations. He started to realize something amazing. The equations he had figured out told stories, not just solved problems. Every number had a distinct significance. And when combined, they created a story that few people could comprehend, and that explained the universe. He felt as though he was translating a hidden language, a mathematical language that could alter people's perceptions of the universe if it were explained. Joaquim was aware that not everyone in his immediate vicinity shared his enthusiasm for mathematics. To others, he was simply pursuing an illogical passion. However, maths was more than just a school subject to him. It served as a means of self-sufficiency, a means of defining himself and the world around him. He realized that maths was a secure refuge where he could fully understand it. Even when his efforts were undervalued, he secretly thought that maths might still help him become famous, not just as a student, but as a pioneer in the subject. Joaquim eventually realized how challenging it was to get accepted to Preston Academy. He and Aisha found themselves on the fringes of the conversation, while the high school elite sat at the same tables every time, sharing tales of their lavish dinners and vacations overseas. Being the sole black student in the class and receiving a scholarship carried significant weight. His attempts to study and succeed, along with his excellent marks, were insufficient to overcome the imperceptible roadblocks that others had put in place. No matter how hard he tried, he would never be one of them. Joaquim was aware that the obstacles went beyond academics. Silent privilege was the foundation of Preston Academy society. Rich students were recognized right away. But he and Aisha had to struggle for their own dignity as well as respect. They lived in an environment that reminded them of their roots all the time, which influenced how they were treated. They were shut out of conversations and possibilities because of the veiled comments and contemptuous glances that surrounded them like an invisible wall. Even if it was subtle, this social isolation proved disastrous. Joaquim viewed the announcement of the state maths championship as his opportunity to finally receive recognition. Being able to stand out and demonstrate the worth of his innovative approach to maths was made possible by the competition. But he was aware that in order to be selected, he would need to get beyond the school's inherent biases in addition to intellectual challenges. The selection would be a struggle against the expectations of a system that had already marginalized him. In addition to being an evaluation of his mathematical prowess, being on the team was only one aspect of Joaquim's struggle for inclusion. It meant that regardless of his origins, he would be acknowledged for his uniqueness and brilliance. He believed that mathematics was a universal tool for expression and discovery rather than the sole domain of a few. He was aware that he would be opposing the system that attempted to categorize him into a narrow identity if he could demonstrate his value in the competition. For him, inclusion meant being acknowledged for his brilliance and being heard, not just being physically there. Joaquim wandered through the downtown streets. Lost in his own thoughts, he was starting to get the impression that something significant was about to happen. Every step he took seemed to bring him closer to realizing his own value and farther away from Preston Academy. He was aware that eventually he would have to ignore peer pressure and concentrate just on his own path. He was starting to realize that the pursuit of his own truth was more significant than his attempt to fit in with the system, and he would have to have more courage to discover that truth. Tell us where you are watching from before we head back. Make sure to subscribe if this tale resonates with you, because I have something very unique planned for you tomorrow. Joaquim saw mathematical difficulties as a mirror of his own inner turmoil. Even though he was dealing with seemingly intractable issues, the answer always appeared when he least anticipated it. Every equation resolved served as a metaphor for conquering one's own obstacles. He came to see that his mathematical journey was about more than simply numbers and formulas. It was also about questioning norms and demonstrating that he could transcend social boundaries in the same way that he did in his mathematical solutions. Challenges turned into inspiration, and he grew more committed to persevering, even if his primary drive was to achieve brilliance. There were always concerns regarding his recognition. Joaquim wasn't sure if he would ever be considered worthy of the chance he so much wanted. He was still plagued by the shadow of social discrimination, and he wasn't sure if his academic success would be sufficient to overcome the imperceptible obstacles in his environment. He believed that despite his best efforts, he would never be completely accepted or acknowledged as being on par with other people. He was still plagued by the worry of being left out. Joaquim was aware of one thing. Though his mathematical prowess and expertise were genuine and unrivaled, he knew his value without the approval of his peers or an unappreciative school system. More significant than any honor or recognition from outside sources was what he had already accomplished within: confidence in his ability and self-assurance. He was prepared to demonstrate that brilliance could not be subdued, even if it was disregarded. Joaquim didn't think anything would alter that day. He was accustomed to being overlooked and unseen. However, he felt a shift in the atmosphere as he walked into the study hall and spotted Felipe Lima, the substitute teacher. Despite Preston Academy's rigorous standards, the young teacher appeared unfazed. His enthusiasm in Joaquim's work seemed sincere, rather than just going over the lesson plan. Felipe went up to him and carefully examined Joaquim's notes. "May I observe what you're doing?" In a kind tone, he inquired, curious but skeptical. Joaquim opened his notebook. Felipe's response caught him off guard. Joaquim hardly ever heard the questions Felipe started asking. "How did you figure out that answer?" He smiled as he asked. The maths instructor was genuinely interested in comprehending Joaquim's innovative technique, rather than disparaging or ridiculing him like the others did. He started to question the young man, but in a positive manner. "For your age, the topological work you're doing is quite sophisticated. Do you know of any theories that address this?" Joaquim was at a loss for words. His work had never before been regarded as significant or even revolutionary in this sense. After hours of discussion, Felipe urged Joaquim to carry out further research and go deeper into the topic he had begun. At last, he remarked, "You have something rare. Your capacity to look beyond conventional fixes. Few people possess that." Joaquim's chest warmed up. For the first time, he was being seen by someone except Aisha or his mother. He pondered. Perhaps he was at last prepared to demonstrate his actual value. "I'm going to send what you've done to some colleagues at the university," Felipe boldly said. "They must witness this." Joaquim paused. Was that a step too big? But with each word Felipe said, his self-confidence increased. He was aware that he could no longer conceal his abilities. This could be his opportunity to be recognized as a person of genuine worth rather than as an anomaly. The objective of presenting the world his maths started to take shape. Joaquim's next several days were a time of anticipation and worry. It looked like a dream when Felipe Lima sent a message to some university colleagues asking them to review his work. He was aware that he had made a significant move, even if he still felt insecure. He now had the opportunity to demonstrate that his vision was correct. Not just to the pupils at Preston Academy, but also to thinkers outside of that closed system, allowing his computations, proofs, and unorthodox methods to finally be viewed as more than simply a mistake or ghetto maths. Joaquim's phone rang after 2 weeks had passed. Felipe was the one. "You won't believe what's happening." "Joaquim." Felipe's voice was bursting with enthusiasm. He clarified that Dr. Patricia Williams, a professor at the University of Chicago, had expressed interest in speaking with him after being pleased by his work, one of the foremost authorities on algebraic topology. She wished to go deeper into the ideas Joaquim had studied. Joaquim was at a loss for words, although he had always known he was unique. He was rendered speechless by the fact that such a significant academic authority had acknowledged him. People were taking notice of him. Joaquim was conflicted as this new truth came to him. He was happy and relieved to be acknowledged as a real mathematician at last. However, he was still troubled by the fight against the educational system that had always devalued him. He was aware that neither his standing at Preston Academy nor the opinions of many of his professors and peers would be altered by this. The contemptuous glances and the hushed jokes persisted despite this awareness. Now, however, Joaquim could not go back. He had a brighter future ahead of him, and he could finally get the acclaim he had long craved, in order to demonstrate that his work was not an exception, but rather a novel approach to mathematics. He made a commitment to travel to Chicago for the meeting with Dr. Patricia Williams, even though he was aware that this was only the beginning. He was unable to ignore the fact that his reality was at last starting to surface. When Joaquim got on the plane to Chicago, he was anxious. He was aware that his encounter with Dr. Patricia Williams had the potential to permanently alter his life. Nevertheless, he was overcome with anxiety. He had no idea what to anticipate. A part of him feared that what he had accomplished would be forgotten once more when he returned. Despite his excitement over the prospect of academic acknowledgement, his worth had never been fully acknowledged by Preston Academy, with its exclusive and exclusive structure, and he pondered whether he would continue to be viewed as an outsider despite this newfound status. The atmosphere around Joaquim shifted when he met Dr. Patricia Williams at the University of Chicago. She smiled warmly at him and proceeded to study his mathematical solutions in silence. Out of respect, it was a complex and technical discussion. Joaquim felt as though he was finally communicating with Dr. Williams, who was genuinely impressed and grasped the intricacy of his ideas. She said, "You could be the next big name in mathematics." And Joaquim kept thinking about it during the conference. He was aware that a significant event was taking place. Following the conversation, Dr. Williams recommended that Joaquim attend an international mathematics conference to report his findings. Although Joaquim was taken aback by the offer, he knew it was his opportunity to truly establish himself in the academic community. He was going to become a reference. He was no longer the student attempting to find his position. He needed this chance to confirm all of his beliefs about mathematics and, more significantly, about himself. Joaquim felt different at Preston Academy. He was no longer worried about other people's opinions, particularly those who had never valued him. He was now aware that he was very brilliant, and this academic accolade simply confirmed it. He felt at ease as soon as he walked inside the classroom. He was aware that he had already accomplished something far more significant, regardless of the treatment he received there. When Joaquim got back from Chicago, he saw a shift in himself. Being acknowledged by professionals in the industry confirmed his love of mathematics and bolstered his conviction that he was headed in the right direction. His personal triumphs, not just his academic ones, seemed to be reflected in every equation and solution he offered. He was now a young man with a promising future instead of the outcast Preston Academy student. But when he encountered the system that had consistently turned him away, his newly discovered self-assurance would be put to the test. Joaquim discovered that the system still treated him with the same lack of concern when he returned to Preston Academy. He was aware that the state championship math competition was drawing near and that it would be his final opportunity to be recognized for who he truly was. Unadulterated, the educational climate, however, did not appear to have altered. The whispered jokes and critical glances were still present in the hallways, despite the possibility that maths could save his life. Social prejudice remained a formidable obstacle. Joaquim felt the weight of every eye that was on him during the state championship tryouts. He was aware that despite his sharp intellect and the creative solutions he had come up with, there were other factors that would determine whether he was selected for the team. It hinged on the acceptance of people who viewed him as an outsider, a kid who didn't conform to the school's established norms. He was afraid of being rejected again and was unable to ignore the prejudice that hovered over him. Joaquim, however, was unwilling to give up. He was aware that his value would not be determined by the world. He chose to turn his fear and nervousness into motivation for his resolve rather than allowing them to rule him. He was more desperate than ever to demonstrate that his perspective on math and of himself was legitimate, inventive, and unrivaled. He would no longer accept being viewed as less or different. He no longer needed approval from an incomprehensible system. He was going to demonstrate that his brilliance was self-evident. Joaquim experienced a mix of anxiety and resolve on the day of the state championship tryouts. There was anxiety in the air as he walked into the examination room. His more affluent peers were among the other contestants who exuded confidence. Joaquim, however, was aware that his strategy would be different. The expectations of others didn't matter to him. He needed to demonstrate to himself that his mathematical perspective was not only sound but innovative. Not to win over others. He had the impression that he was going to shatter the unseen bonds that held him when he walked into that chamber. Even though the problems were challenging, Joaquim acted without hesitation. His thoughts moved naturally through theorems and equations. He started by approaching each problem in a different way, combining topology, geometry, and even algebraic ideas that he had created. Joaquim demonstrated how something seemingly complex on the day of the meeting. Joaquim finally experienced a sensation he had never experienced before. The whole of mathematics was right in front of him, ready to be challenged by his ideas. He realized as he looked around in preparation for his presentation. He was aware that it was no longer about gaining recognition or acceptance from a select few. It was about something more significant: his voice in mathematics, his contribution to the field. He held, in a sense, the future. He was prepared to grab it. For Joaquim, the days before the conference were a mix of excitement and nervousness. He felt the weight of obligation, but he also understood that this presentation had the power to change his life. He rehearsed his presentation aloud, went over his material, and spent restless nights honing his hypothesis. He was terrified, but he also knew that he couldn't afford to be hesitant. He had always known he was a genius, and he was prepared to prove it. He was prepared to shine now that he was out of the academic shadows. The atmosphere of the meeting was different from anything Joaquim had ever encountered when he arrived. He felt that he was at last in the correct spot because of the significance of the occasion and the presence of distinguished scientists and scholars from all over the world. As he observed the presentations of the other speakers, he started to realize how significant his own contribution was. However, a question still persisted. Will my idea, my unique strategy, actually be accepted? He was aware that his work was valuable, but he was unsure of how the academic community would respond to it. His anxiousness transformed into tangible energy when it was his turn to present. Joaquim stepped onto the stage, turned to face the rapt audience, and started talking. He was more concerned with being sincere than with pleasing others. He observed the audience's response as he presented his thesis in a straightforward and accurate manner, as though everyone was taking in every word. There was a profound hush. The room erupted in unanimity and applause as he concluded his presentation. In that instant, Joaquim realized that something had changed. The affirmative response was the validation Joaquim required. He felt incredibly recognized in addition to being fascinated by the mathematicians and instructors in attendance. He had gone beyond what he believed was possible. The assurance that his conception of mathematics had a place in the world ultimately outweighed the acclaim. He was prepared to establish a career founded on creativity rather than compliance. Despite the challenges, he now understood that the road he had chosen was the only one he should take. If this story resonated with you, tell someone who needs motivation to stand up for what's right. Remember that empathy and respect have the capacity to change lives. And sign up for more transformational stories. Remember to never undervalue anybody based solely on their outward appearance.